Welcome to the lesson for Así se dice, Level 1, Chapter 3. We've already defined what infinitives are because we talked about two of them already. We've begun our course with the infinitive ser, and then we continued by working with the infinitive tener. And the form of the verb before it's conjugated is called the infinitive. Infinitives always translate as to be, in this case, or to have. So we can't really use it very well in a sentence. There's not much opportunity to say I to be nice, but there is plenty of opportunity to say I am nice, and so we've learned to conjugate. We defined conjugate as matching the correct verb form to the subject pronoun. And so conjugate as a verb, it does mean that. It means to change the form of the infinitive according to the subject. So if we have the need to conjugate verbs, which means change them according to the subject pronouns, then let's again review what are the subject pronouns. And by now we know subject pronouns are the words for I, you, he, she, the other word for you, which is more formal, we, which could also be a feminine ending, so we could see a nosotras ending, and then ellos, ellas, and ustedes. So we're looking at our subject pronouns that we've worked with when we've been conjugating ser and tener. So in the next spaces on your listening sheet, go ahead and conjugate the verb ser, and then fill in the forms of the verb tener, and then click to the next slide. Your conjugated forms of the verb ser should look just like this. So again, we're arranging them in first person, second person, third person order. Singular verb forms on the left, plural verb forms on the right. We've talked about that. So yo matches with soy, and tú with eres, and él or ella or usted would go with es. And then with the verb tener, the second infinitive that we have practiced with so far, we have the forms again matching up with the first person, second person, third person. And so we've gotten used to conjugating, and working with those in sentences. So now we're ready to really expand into some new territory, we could call it, because we're going to start talking about lots more infinitives. And if we already defined what an infinitive is, and we can use words like conjugate and conjugation, conjugation is a form that you haven't really heard before, because in Spanish, when we talk about infinitives, there are actually three different kinds. The first grouping or the first conjugation ends in AR, which means that there are going to be a whole bunch, if we can use that word, of verbs that we're going to be working with that are in the infinitive form that will have to be conjugated that will end in AR. There are two other groups of endings, and we'll see those in the next chapter. There are infinitives that end in ER, and there are infinitives that end in IR, but we're not going to be working with those yet. So as far as we're thinking for now, we'll just forget about the fact that there are really three different kinds of infinitives, and we'll concentrate right now working only with the AR infinitives. So to conjugate a verb that ends in AR, I'm going to follow a couple of simple steps. Here's an example of a verb that we will be using a lot as we work in our new chapter, because this verb, this infinitive that ends in AR, translates to talk. And that's something we do a lot in a classroom, so that's a good verb to start with. So working with conjugating AR verbs like hablar, you have some steps. First step is to remove that AR ending, the thing that we said makes it part of the first conjugation. That's how we recognize it. So we're going to take it away, because the part that's left is what is going to be repeated throughout all of the conjugated forms of this verb. This part that's left is called the stem. So if we begin with this verb hablar, and we can fill it in on our sheet as we go in your listening sheet. We have this verb that is part of a first conjugation because we tell it ends in AR. So it translates to talk. But again, usually we need to conjugate. We need to match it up with which subject pronoun, which person is doing the talking. Is it part of the first, second, or third person? Or are we talking about a plural subject pronoun? And so, again, we have to always remember our subject pronouns in the order that they go, because that's going to help us as we're working our way through conjugating. I'll just put down the el, but you know that can be ella and usted, and this could be ellas and ustedes. You already have that in the chart. But if I said, okay, take away the AR because the part that's left is the stem, that's the piece of the verb that will not change. So when we're conjugating these AR verbs, this piece of the verb is easy because once you figure out, okay, the stem is going to be the stem all the way through, you just keep repeating the stem. And then we'll go back through to put endings on that will show us that the verb is in the yo form. The yo form ending happens to be an O. Okay, and then the second person to form ending, it is an AS. In the third person, when we work with él, ella, or usted, that ending is A. For the nosotros ending, we would see an AMOS. And for the ellos ending, we will see AN. So what we're looking at is a set of endings now. We can keep applying over and over again to any AR verb that we want to work with. And in our chapter, we'll probably have a dozen or so. So be sure to fill in the verb charts that are provided on your listening sheet. We'll begin by filling in the stem for the verb that's given. The verb that's given is going to be the verb hablar. So we said that the stem is the piece that's left right here when you've taken away the AR ending. That's the piece that I wrote first because it's constant. It's the thing that stays. And that's the piece that I'm going to recognize because eventually I'm going to know anything that starts with HABL has to do with talking. And on the second chart in the back of your paper, you want to now conjugate the verb by adding the endings. So again, we're talking about a yo form ending, a tu form ending, all right, all the way through your conjugated forms. On page 92 to 93 of your textbook, you'll find a lot of AR verbs that are being used in the classroom setting. So if we're taking a look at the first picture, it tells you to take a look at the textbook, page 92 to 93. And you see a picture of la profesora in front of the class. And if we do a practice with the verb that has to do with the action of a teacher, that verb enseñar, the way you can see it in your textbook, or right here if you're not opening your book, that's okay. Enseñar, you'll eventually learn, okay, it's an infinitive. I can tell it's an infinitive because it ends with AR, and that tells me it's a first conjugation verb. And it means to do something. In this case, it means to teach. So when you think about enseñar, you want to try to picture the teacher standing up in front of the classroom, actively going through teaching. And if we follow what we said about how to conjugate, then we have a first step, which will be to take away the AR, so that the piece that's left is the piece of the verb that I will always recognize once I learn it, that anything that starts this way with enseña, with a tilde, has to do with teaching. So my first step, as we said before, is to copy the stem numerous times, one for each person, and then to go back through and put on the endings that will show you the first person doing the action, enseño. Translation, I teach. Second person ends with AS always for AR verbs. Enseñas, you teach. Enseña would translate as she teaches. And then we'll have the AMOS ending for nosotros, so we teach. And then finally AN for they teach. So now looking at your practice sheet, you'll see 8 more. sentences that you can practice conjugating with. So you read the sentence, you look at the subject of the sentence, you decide is that first, second, or third person, singular or plural, and then find your stem and think about those endings that match up with each of the different persons. And we have this idea before, we know we're conjugating. Okay? And your next step, of course, would be, well, let's figure out what we actually said. And if you can, go ahead and put the meanings down for those infinitives, because this is the beginning of learning a lot of AR verbs that are going to be helpful to us when we speak in Spanish. Okay, so hasta mañana, and I hope that you did a good job with the video.